2 minutes ago, Iranian missiles struck the one target nobody in this conflict expected Iran to actually hit. Not a radar installation, not a military airbase, not a logistics hub, the water, the pumping stations, the desalination plants, and the pipeline network that carry drinking water to 4 million people in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area are no longer operational. And the 4 million people whose taps are running dry right now, right this moment as you watch this, their government has not told them a single word about what just happened. No emergency broadcast, no timeline, no instructions, nothing. That silence is going to be the most consequential decision the Netanyahu government has made in this entire conflict. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to show you exactly why. Most people who follow this conflict have heard of Mekorot as Israel's national water utility. What most people haven't grasped is the degree to which that single company controls the biological survival of the Israeli population. Mekorot National Water Company operates approximately 90% of Israel's national water infrastructure. That isn't a significant market share. That is near total control of a resource without which human beings cannot survive beyond 3 days. The company manages the desalination plants running along Israel's Mediterranean coastline, the facilities that transform seawater into the fresh drinking water that the majority of the country depends on. It operates the pumping stations that maintain pressure across the national water carrier network. It manages the storage reservoirs that serve as buffer capacity between production and consumption, the reserves that keep water flowing to taps during the gaps between production cycles. And it maintains the pipeline grid that physically moves water from desalination plants and storage to the 4 million residential and commercial connections in the Tel Aviv area alone. Iran didn't strike a node in that network. It struck the primary production and distribution infrastructure whose removal doesn't reduce supply. It eliminates it. The natural water sources, the aquifers, the Sea of Galilee, the Jordan River tributaries do not produce sufficient volume to supply the country's current population without the desalination contribution. This is not a gap that can be papered over. When the desalination infrastructure goes dark, the natural sources do not compensate. They can't. The volume deficit between what naturally occurring water sources produce and what 4 million people in Tel Aviv require every single day is a gap that bottled water, emergency trucking, and improvised collection cannot bridge at the speed and volume the situation demands. What Iran struck this morning did not reduce Israel's water supply. It removed it. The residual water sitting in the pipes and storage tanks of the distribution network will be consumed within hours, not days. Hours. And the moment those reserves are gone, the taps go dry, and 4 million people are now living in a conflict zone without the most basic resource human biology requires, and their government told them nothing. A human being requires 2 to 3 liters of drinking water per day to maintain basic physiological function. That is the floor, the minimum below which the body begins to fail. 4 million people require between 8 and 12 million liters of drinking water per day at that minimum threshold. That number does not account for sanitation. It does not account for food preparation. It does not account for the hospitals already running at surge capacity from the sustained missile campaign. It doesn't account for the fire services responding to the blazes the hypersonic strikes have been setting across Tel Aviv's districts. The minimum drinking water requirement alone for 4 million people is a logistics problem no emergency distribution system, no matter how well organized, no matter how well funded, can solve at scale in the hours immediately following a total water infrastructure strike. The bottled water reserves in Israeli supermarkets and emergency stockpiles will be consumed within hours of the population grasping what has actually happened to their water supply. The emergency water trucking capacity in Israel's civil defense infrastructure was designed to supplement a constrained system, not to replace a completely absent one. There is no contingency plan built to deliver 12 million liters of drinking water per day to 4 million people by truck. That logistics architecture does not exist anywhere in the world because no one built one for this scenario. And the 4 million people who are about to start competing for whatever bottled and distributed water remains, they have been given zero warning, zero guidance, zero preparation time, because the government has gone silent. The hospital dimension of this water strike deserves its own specific analysis, because it is the most immediately life-threatening consequence of the infrastructure loss, and the one the government's silence is most directly endangering. Israel's hospitals were already running under sustained pressure before this morning. They are receiving casualties from the missile campaign. They are managing the accumulated medical burden of a civilian population living under weeks of ballistic missile bombardment. Hospitals running under those conditions depend on water, not as a convenience, but as a clinical requirement that cannot be substituted or deferred. Surgical procedures require sterile water. Wound treatment requires water. Infection control requires water. And dialysis patients require water at a volume and purity standard that emergency distribution simply cannot provide on the timeline that dialysis demands. A dialysis patient who misses a session does not experience discomfort. They experience organ failure. The hospital system operating at the edge of its capacity before the water strike is now operating without the water infrastructure its clinical functions depend on to keep people alive. The Israeli government knows exactly which hospitals are affected. It knows which clinical functions are at immediate risk. It knows which patient populations, the dialysis patients, the post-surgical patients, the intensive care patients, face life-threatening consequences from a water interruption measured in hours rather than days. And it has said nothing to those hospitals, to the medical staff, or to the patients and their families who need that information right now to make decisions about care that cannot wait. That silence is not operational security. It is a government that has no answer for what is happening and has chosen silence over the admission that it has none. To understand why the water supply strike is a fundamentally different kind of action than every other Iranian strike in this conflict, you have to understand the logic Iran has been working from, and what it calculated this strike would achieve that the previous ones had not. Every earlier strike in this war targeted infrastructure whose loss degraded Israel's military capability or its government's operational continuity. The radar installations degraded the defensive architecture. The interceptor stockpile attrition reduced protective coverage. Ben-Gurion's closure severed logistics and evacuation pipelines. The American base strikes removed the external support architecture. Each of those targets was military or strategic in the way that military analysts measure strategic value. The water supply is different. Striking it does not degrade Israel's ability to fire missiles or intercept incoming rounds. It degrades Israel's civilian population's ability to maintain the basic biological functions that human life requires. That distinction matters enormously because it tells you what Iran calculated this strike would achieve that the previous strikes hadn't. The previous strikes produced military consequences and political pressure. The water supply strike produces a civilian population that is thirsty, not metaphorically pressured, not strategically disadvantaged, thirsty. 4 million people whose most basic physical need is not being met, and whose government has not told them when it will be met again. Iran has escalated before, against energy, against military bases, against airports. But reports suggest that Iran's strategic planners have been calculating the distance between accumulated military pressure on the Netanyahu government and the threshold at which that pressure produces a political outcome Iran cannot achieve through military strikes alone. The water strike is Iran's answer to that calculation. Because you cannot frame a water outage, you cannot provide context for empty taps, you cannot explain to a parent why their child cannot have a glass of water in a way that the parent will find adequate. And no government communication strategy in history has ever successfully managed that conversation. The political precision of the water supply strike is the part of this story that hasn't fully landed yet in most coverage. Every previous failure in this conflict, the radar gaps, the interceptor shortfalls, the airport closure, the Dimona strikes, could be managed within a narrative of hard choices made under extraordinary circumstances. Military infrastructure failures are difficult to defend politically, but they are at least legible within the framework of a conflict narrative. Leaders can explain military losses as the cost of a difficult war. The water supply is not a military target. It is not subject to that analytical framing. The moment an Israeli parent turns on a tap and nothing comes out, the only question that matters is the most fundamental question a citizen has ever asked of a government. Why can't my family have water to drink? And there is no strategic answer to that question. There is no geopolitical context that makes it adequate. There is no communication strategy that makes it acceptable. Iran chose this target because it understood that distinction. The water strike is not Iran's most destructive action of this conflict. It may not have produced the highest casualty count or the most dramatic military degradation. But it is Iran's most politically precise action because it produces a civilian consequence that is universally understood, immediately personal, and completely impossible to manage through the tools the Israeli government has been deploying for weeks. That is what civilian survival infrastructure means as a strategic concept, and that is why striking it is categorically different from everything that came before. To understand the full weight of what the water supply strike means for the Netanyahu government, you need to see it in the context of everything that has already happened to that government's political position in the weeks before this morning. The corruption trial has continued throughout this conflict, with Netanyahu's legal situation providing a constant undercurrent of domestic political pressure that no military operation has been able to silence. Reports suggest the pardon process hit significant obstacles. Then came the American withdrawal from active support for Israeli offensive operations, a shift that fundamentally altered the strategic calculus and the public narrative the government had been building around American backing. Then Ben-Gurion Airport's closure, which severed the psychological and logistical connection between Israel and the outside world in a way that no amount of official framing could minimize. Then the Dimona strikes, the nuclear facilities, which represented the single most psychologically resonant infrastructure loss in Israeli strategic consciousness. then the hypersonic missile barrages that set fires across Tel Aviv's districts. Each of those events added weight to a government that started this conflict with a promise of quick, decisive action and found itself managing an accumulation of failures that no communication strategy could reverse, and now 4 million people in Israel's largest metropolitan area with nothing to drink. Every previous failure was a failure of military or strategic infrastructure. This is a failure of the most basic obligation a government holds toward its civilian population, the obligation that precedes every other political promise, every strategic calculation, every military claim, the obligation to ensure that the people it governs have water to drink. That obligation is not strategic. It is not military. It is not subject to the framing that has allowed the government to manage every previous failure within a narrative of difficult choices. It is the obligation that every Israeli parent, every child turning on a dry tap this morning, will measure their government against. And by the measure of that obligation, the government has already failed. The international response to the water supply strike is moving through multiple capitals simultaneously, and it is being driven not by strategic calculation but by the humanitarian dimension of 4 million people losing access to drinking water in an active conflict zone. The International Committee of the Red Cross issued a statement identifying the water infrastructure strike as a potential violation of international humanitarian law, specifically the provisions prohibiting attacks on objects indispensable to civilian survival. That framing matters because it shifts the legal and political ground beneath Israel's allies in a way that military infrastructure strikes do not. Those allies, the governments that have been managing their public support for the conflict within the framework of Israel's right to self-defense, are now managing a domestic public opinion environment in which the images and accounts coming out of Tel Aviv are not images of military strikes on military targets. They are accounts of people with nothing to drink, of hospitals struggling to operate, of parents lining up at emergency water distribution points in a city that, until this morning, had functioning tap water. That shift, from military infrastructure failure to civilian survival failure, is the shift that changes the international political environment in ways that military strikes on military targets do not. Allies can sustain political pressure at home when the story is about defense against missiles. It becomes significantly harder to sustain that position when the story is about children without water in a city under fire. The international political space that the Israeli government needs to continue this conflict is narrowing in real time, and the water supply strike is the single event most responsible for that narrowing. There is a conflict happening inside this conflict that most of the coverage has missed, not the military conflict between Israeli and Iranian strike packages. That conflict has been analyzed extensively. The conflict I'm referring to is the one happening inside Israeli society between a population that has been asked to endure an extraordinary accumulation of losses and a government that has chosen silence over transparency at every critical moment. The interceptor failures, the moments when missiles got through the defensive architecture, were met with silence about the system's limitations. The Dimona strikes were met with silence about the nuclear infrastructure's vulnerability. The airport closure was met with silence about the timeline for reopening and the implications for evacuation options. And now the water supply strike is being met with silence about the most basic fact a civilian population in a crisis needs to know. When will the taps work again? That pattern of silence is not a communication strategy. Communication strategies are designed to manage information flow in ways that serve a political objective. A consistent pattern of silence in the face of infrastructure failures is something different. It is a government that has run out of ways to describe what is happening to its country and has made the calculation, conscious or unconscious, that its civilian population discovering the consequences of each failure themselves is preferable to the government having to explain them. That calculation has a political cost, and the water supply strike is the moment that cost has become impossible to defer. There is a question hanging over this conflict that no strategic framework, no military analysis, and no government communication strategy can answer. And the water supply strike is the event that has made it impossible to avoid. At what point does a civilian population that has watched its airports closed, its nuclear facilities struck, its largest city set on fire, and its water supply destroyed, all within the span of weeks, decide that the government managing those failures has exhausted its mandate to continue? That is not a military question. It is not a strategic question. It cannot be answered through intercept rates, missile counts, or operational briefings. It is a human question. It is the question being asked by 4 million people with nothing to drink in a city that is simultaneously managing missile strikes, infrastructure failures, and a government that has gone silent about all of them. The threshold question is this: Iran's decision to strike the water, rather than another military or strategic infrastructure target, tells you something specific about what Iran calculated was the remaining distance between the current political pressure on the Netanyahu government and the threshold at which that pressure produces an outcome Iran cannot achieve through military strikes alone. The water strike is Iran's judgment that the remaining distance was small enough that a civilian survival consequence, immediate, personal, and impossible to frame, could close it. Whether Iran's calculation is correct is the open question this conflict now turns on. Because if it is, the water supply strike is not just the most politically precise Iranian action of this conflict. It is the action that ends it. And if it isn't, if the Israeli government and Israeli society find a way to absorb even this failure, then the question of what Iran does next and how much further it is willing to go in targeting civilian survival infrastructure becomes the most consequential question in Middle Eastern geopolitics. The practical dimension of what comes next for the 4 million people in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area is a logistics and governance challenge unlike any Israel has faced since the country's founding, and it is a challenge the government is currently failing in real time through silence. Emergency water distribution is being organized at local government level in some districts. Reports suggest that municipal authorities, not the national government, have been faster to respond to the immediate crisis. But municipal emergency distribution is designed for localized disruptions. It is not designed to replace the entire water supply of Israel's largest metropolitan area indefinitely. The math of 12 million liters per day minimum just for drinking does not work at trucking scale. It does not work at bottling scale. It works only when the desalination plants and pipeline network are operational, and those facilities sustained direct kinetic impact. The repair timeline for primary desalination infrastructure is measured in weeks at minimum, and that is under normal conditions with full access to parts, labor, and operational security. None of those conditions apply in a conflict environment where the facilities that were struck once can be struck again. The engineers who would repair the desalination plants are living in the same city that is under sustained missile bombardment. The parts required are not stockpiled in the volumes needed. And the security environment makes sustained infrastructure repair work a direct physical risk for the workers required to do it. 4 million people are not going to have tap water back tomorrow. They may not have it back next week, and the government that is supposed to be telling them this has chosen silence. The Israeli government's decision to go silent about the water supply strike is the most revealing dimension of this entire story, and it deserves direct analysis rather than being left as a backdrop to the strategic and political narrative. Governments go silent about military failures for understandable reasons: operational security, preventing the enemy from assessing damage, avoiding panic. Those rationales have limits, and the water supply strike has exceeded every one of them. There is no operational security rationale for not telling 4 million people that their water supply has been struck and that the taps will run dry within hours. Iran knows what it struck. The damage assessment from the Iranian perspective was confirmed the moment the missiles hit. The only population that can be prevented from knowing what happened is the Israeli civilian population. And that is precisely what has happened. The government is not protecting operational security. It is protecting a narrative, the narrative that the conflict is being managed, that the government has the situation under control, that the failures are being addressed. A water supply strike affecting 4 million people blows that narrative apart in a way that cannot be reconstructed through press conferences and strategic briefings. So the government chose silence. Not because silence serves the civilian population, it doesn't. Not because silence serves operational security, it can't. But because silence, however briefly, delays the moment when the political consequences of this failure arrive. That delay is being purchased at the cost of 4 million people who could have been using the last hours of functioning water pressure to fill every container they have, to prepare for what is coming, and to make decisions about the days ahead. That is the silence that matters. Not the strategic silence of a government managing difficult information responsibly, the silence of a government choosing its own political survival over its population's preparation time. And 4 million Israelis are going to discover the difference tap by dry tap in the hours ahead. Step back from the operational and the political for a moment and look at what this conflict has revealed about the architecture of modern civilian life and how catastrophically fragile it is. Israel is one of the most technologically advanced nations on Earth. Its water infrastructure, the desalination technology, the network management systems, the distribution architecture, represents decades of engineering achievement and billions of dollars of investment. It solved one of the fundamental challenges facing a modern nation-state in an arid region: how to guarantee water security for a growing urban population in a water-scarce environment. That solution, built over 40 years, was eliminated in minutes. That is the civilizational fact this conflict has exposed. The infrastructure that sustains modern civilian life, water, power, communications, transportation, is not robust against sustained precision strikes. It is fragile, it is concentrated, it is designed for efficiency, not for resilience against kinetic attack. And when it fails, the social systems that depend on it fail in cascade. The water fails and the hospitals struggle. The hospitals struggle, and the casualties from the missile strikes receive degraded care. The degraded care produces outcomes that would not have occurred in a functioning system, and all of this is happening simultaneously, layered on top of each other, in a city of millions of people trying to continue living their lives in the gaps between missile barrages. This is what civilian vulnerability looks like in 21st century warfare, and the water supply strike is the most vivid single illustration of it this conflict has produced. History will assess the water supply strike as a turning point, not because of what it did to Israel's military capability, but because of what it revealed about the limits of the Israeli government's ability to govern its civilian population through the crisis it created. The mandate to govern is not a permanent condition. It is renewed continuously through the relationship between a government and the people it serves. It is renewed when the government protects its population from threats. It is renewed when the government is transparent about failures and responsive to civilian needs. It is renewed through the accumulation of small demonstrations that the people in power are managing the country's interests rather than their own political survival. The Netanyahu government has spent weeks consuming that mandate faster than it can renew it. The military failures have consumed it. The silence has consumed it. The airport closure, the nuclear strikes, the fires across Tel Aviv's districts, all of it has consumed the mandate at a rate that no government communication strategy has been able to replace. And now the water is gone. 4 million people with dry taps and a government that said nothing. That is the political situation the water supply strike has produced. And the question that hangs over it, the question Iran calculated would hang over it when it chose this target above all others, is whether the Israeli government has enough mandate remaining to survive the answer to the most basic question 4 million people are asking it right now.